All right, welcome everybody to our next lecture on Mora Nevuchim and the Guide of the Perplexed. And we are in part 1, chapter 73. What Rambam is about to do is describe to us, he's going to describe to us two systems of thought, two systems of philosophy, which were the most prevalent in his area in his time, the kinds that he was very well read up on, each of which proved an understanding of the universe that was unique, and each of which rested on what they considered to be scientific / philosophical principles. And and then Rambam is going to develop his own take on how to prove ultimately the existence of God, or really what he considers the four ultimate questions, which are the existence of God, the oneness of God, the incorporeality of God, that he has no body, and that the world was created in time and it hasn't been around forever. Those four basic principles. The first system he's going to tell us, one gets the sense that he's telling this to us because he wants us to know how familiar he was with the system, but then he's going to reject it as a method of proving those four questions. But he's going to go through how they prove those four questions. A lot of this is based on a science and a philosophy that's very foreign to us into the year 2023. But as you'll see when we go through it, there's still a lot that we can learn from it. So we're going to have to screw our heads on and wind them backwards in time about 1,000 years. So this is the system of the Mutakallimun. The Mutakallimun, and if I'm mispronouncing this, forgive me. It's just, I don't know how to pronounce it properly, but that's the best I can do. These were a group of Islamic philosophers who wanted to develop a scientific / philosophical underpinning for Islam that contrasted with the Greek philosophers, and the Greek philosophers who did not conclude the same conclusions of monotheistic philosophy, that the world was created in time, those four questions. So the Mutakallimun, the Rambam is going to spend time describing their ideas, and then he's going to describe how they come to prove those four questions. Remember, the four questions being, again, the fact that God exists, the fact that God is one, the fact that he doesn't have a body, and the fact that the world was created in time. And then he's going to explain why he doesn't like their process. And that's going to complete book 1 of Mora Nevuchim, in which place we'll make some sort of a l'chaim or celebration or something when we do that. And then he's going to go to the Aristotelian school, and he's going to develop the Aristotelian philosophy. And he's going to say in the end that he's going to use Aristotle and then veer a little bit off and create what Rambam says is his take on how we prove those four questions. So, and that what I just said now, the Aristotelian part is going to be the beginning of book 2. So I must tell you that we're going to have a lot of stuff that seems archaic, seems old, and it may not seem that interesting from our perspective today, but there's still a lot to learn from it. And we got to hold tight because we decided we're going to learn this whole book. I mean, there's parts of it that'll be really exciting and fun, and parts of it that we're going to struggle through. Forgive me if there are some occasions here and there which I myself am struggling to fully comprehend. I'm not professionally trained. I don't have a PhD in medieval philosophy, but I'm doing the best I can. So we'll just bear with it. So here we go. We're about to start chapter 73. I'm not necessarily going to read everything directly, and I also have to apologize that I am using my old laptop because I forgot to bring my good laptop from work, so the camera goes fuzzy every once in a while. So when it does, I'm going to take myself out of the middle of the screen. Please forgive me. So we're going to start with chapter 73, the common premises laid down by the Mutakallimun. These are the groups of philosophers that I just described to you. They in spite of the diversity, obviously there's a lot of them, many of them think that there's 12 there's 12 premises, 12 basic premises that they agree upon. So he's going to list those 12 premises. First, a summary of the 12. The first, establishing the existence of atoms. The second, the existence of a vacuum. He's going to go into each one in more detail in a minute. The third is that time is composed of instants. In other words, time is composed also, it's not continuous, but it's composed of units. The fourth, that substance cannot be exempt from a certain number of accidents. And the term accident, the Hebrew translations are mikra. I think a better way of understanding it in modern times would be a quality, meaning a specific quality that pertains to a specific object. So a classic would be the color. Like if you see an object and it has the red color, the red is an accident, meaning it's a quality that that object has. The sixth premise is that an accident does not endure for 2 units of time. And he'll explain what that means. But basically, everything, since it's all broken, well, we'll get to it when he talks about it in detail. The seventh premise, that the status of a habitus is that of their privation. We'll say that more. Just listen to the words. It might sound strange, but we'll understand it when we do it in more detail. The eighth, that nothing except everything exists is made out of substances and their qualities. And again, we'll understand that in more detail. He doesn't mean for us to even understand what he's listing at now. That's why he explains them in more detail. The ninth, that accidents do not support one another. The 10th, that the possibility of a thing. Okay, the 11th, you know what, I'm just going to skip through this. Let's just do them in detail. So if we look on page 195, he starts explaining the first premise. So here goes. The first premise is meaning that they thought of the world as a whole as composed of very small particles that, because of their subtlety, are not subject to division. This is something that goes back to the Greeks, and there was debated whether or not the world can be divided into tiny particles, and there's all sorts of interesting debates about it. But the Mutakallimun said that the world is made up of these atoms. So basically, an individual part, each particle doesn't possess quantity in any respect. In other words, you can't say that this is, this is 2 of anything. In other words, once you break it down to its smallest particle, you eventually get to a smallest particle. It's interesting. We think about, nowadays, we know the world breaks down into atoms. Everything breaks down into atoms, but then the atoms break down into subatomic particles. Well, what is subatomic part? So is there a particle that's like the bottom line particle? Well, I don't know. Ask a physicist. But whatever that bottom line particle is, that's the atom that they're talking about. So what happens is when you take a bunch of them together, when several are aggregated, now you can count and you can say there's 20 of them or 1,000 of them or 10 billion of them or whatever. And that creates a body that we see, which is made up of an aggregate of all these little particles. So, and then fine. So all these, each and every one of these atoms is exactly the same. In other words, within a body, right, within something that you're looking at, all of the particles that make up that body are identical. And there's no difference between one and the next. So so basically it's impossible that any body should exist in any respect unless it's composed of these particles, and they're each one exactly alike. And that's why they are all together and they all add up to make this thing that you're looking at. In this way, when something generation exists, in other words, when an object becomes created, it becomes created by collecting all these atoms together. When an object ceases to exist, it ceases to exist because these atoms fall apart and they're no longer together. But they don't consider it corruption. They consider it aggregation and separation, motion and rest. Right? When things move, they get together, they create an item, and then they come apart and the item ceases to exist. They also say that these particles are not restricted in their existence, as was believed by Epicurus and others who affirm the existence of particles. For they say that God may be exalted, he creates them constantly. So this would be against the idea that we know now that, the basic rule of physics that matter cannot be created or destroyed to change from one form to another. They believe that they do get created and destroyed. So that's the idea of atoms. So that's the first premise, okay? Everything is made up of atoms. So if you look at a table, the table is made up of billions of table atoms. each one having the quality of a table. And when you put them all together, you see a table. If you see a carpet, yeah, it's made of billions of carpet atoms, and so on and so forth. The second premise is the assertion concerning a vacuum. And what does this mean? And here's the idea, right? There has to be space with nothing in it. And why does that have to be? Because if the world is made up, if the universe, for example, is made up of atoms and there's no space, right? Then how does anything move, right? And for an atom to get together and create something, the atom has to move and get together. So it's, I've just turned the page. This premise is necessary, 196 in the Pines, is necessary for them because of their belief in the first premise. If the world were full of particles, how can anything move? How could there be motion? It would be impossible to imagine that one body can penetrate into another one. So there has to be such a thing as space. So, and the way space works is that, and the way motion works is when an atom or a bunch of atoms move through space to another spot. So that's the second premise. This is the premise and the idea that there has to be a vacuum. There has to be a place of space between those atoms. The third premise is the way they divide time. And this gets very a little challenging, but I'll try to explain it in my own words. So the first paragraph that I'm explaining in my own words is on page 196, the third premise. This is their saying that time is composed of instants. So basically, this premise is necessary because of the first premise, because they undoubtedly understood from Aristotle's demonstrations that he demonstrated that distance, time, and locomotion are all three equal. What does that mean? So when we think, this is before Newtonian physics, right? So, but this is the ideas that planted the seeds for Newtonian physics once and someday in the future to be developed. So Aristotle understood that that distance, time, and motion are related, right? You measure motion based on the distance it goes in a certain amount of time. So all those three things, those three concepts are related, right? So I mean to say their relation to one another is the same. So if you divide motion and say it moved half as much, that means the distance was half as much. And that also means that the time was half as much, right? That kind of makes sense, right? So because the Mutakallimun knew this, they knew necessarily that if time were continuous and infinitely divisible, if there was no units of time, right, then the particles would have to be indivisible. So right, the particles that they thought were indivisible, in other words, the tiniest part, which they're saying is the bottom line, and you can't get smaller than the tiniest atom, but that has to be divisible because it's continuous. So it wouldn't make sense. So therefore, they suppose that distance is also so distance, time, and time is also not continuous. So basically, time has to be breakdownable into units of time. So so there's units of time that, you know, and so you break up an hour into 60 minutes, a minute into 60 seconds, and a second you divide it up into 60 thirds. So, and thus the division of time ends up with parts. The bottom line being that that you can't that time has to be divisible by units as well. So time cannot be continuous. So there's units that are tiny, and however you measure them, whatever number you give them is name you give them is fine. But the bottom line is that the time also has to be. This was their thought process. Okay, so this is their third premise. On page 197 now, he says he goes through why this particular premise gets a little confusing and kind of gets a little messy. So as a necessary consequence, they were compelled to admit, right, if motion is the passage of an atom, right, belonging to these particles from one atom to another that is continuing, in other words, motion is one atom going and moving towards and coming to the space of the next one. So then no movement can be more rapid than another movement, because if you divide time to its smallest amount, and atom to its smallest amount, and distance to its smallest amount, then every movement is always just a bunch of the same exact thing. So how is it then that one thing could move faster than another? I'm gonna tell you that if you want to read this, you can read through 197, this long thing. But he says, like, so that people would ask the Mutakallimun, if that's the case, how it is that one thing goes faster than another. So they they told him that they would come up with all kinds of clever ways to explain how that can happen. And Rambam kind of knocks, pokes a little fun at this idea, but I really, it gets kind of complex. So I apologize, but you're more than welcome to read it yourself and enjoy the intellectual entertainment. But you should not think, I turn to page 198, that the doctrines I have explained to you are the most abhorrent, meaning are the craziest, because I just showed you some crazy conclusions that one might come following from these three premises. Because, then he attacks the idea of the vacuum. Furthermore, the doctrine I mentioned with regard to, again, I'm going to leave this paragraph out. Let's go to the fourth premise. The fourth premise is they're saying that accidents exist. What does that mean? Accidents mean, like I said before, it's easier to understand that as a quality, the quality of the atom, right? So meaning that every atom has a quality to it. So like I said, the table atoms are all made up of tiny little particles. Each atom, which is the smallest particle, has a table quality to it, and all of them together make up a table. So if this premise did not mean more than this, it would be correct. However, they say that in every substance in which there does not subsist the accidents of life, right? So they add to that and say they understand that certain accidents and other certain qualities are opposite of other qualities. So if an atom has a quality of life to it, then it can't have the quality of death, and vice versa, right? And if the absence of a specific quality is attributed to an atom, then it must have the corollary of that, at least according to the Mutakallimun's thought. To sum up, there must necessarily subsist in it all the accidents that can exist, or one of the opposites of those accidents. So whatever qualities could exist within an atom, right? Whether it's color, whether it's life or death, whether it's cold or hot, whether it's however whatever quality you can come up with, it has to have either one or its opposite. So then the differentiation between each atom is the sum total of all the different, what he's calling accidents, what I'm calling qualities that pertain to that particular atom. So those are four premises. So again, number one, the world, every items are made out of atoms. Number two, there's vacuum between the atoms. Number three, time is also made of time atoms, so to speak. And number four, right, that every atom has a whole bunch of qualities which we're calling accidents, but the qualities which pertain to that particular atom, and that the two opposites can't exist within each other. So the fifth premise is they're saying that these accidents subsist in the atom and that it cannot be exempt from them, right? So in other words, there's no such thing as a quality without an atom, right? You have to have the explanation and meaning is as follows. Every atom of the atoms that God creates is provided with accidents from which it cannot be exempt. So for example, color, smell, motion, or rest, but not quantity, because remember, atoms don't have quantity. So in accordance with their opinion, okay, fine. In virtue of this premise, they hold with regard to all accidents subsisting in a body that it should not be said that one of them is a proprium of that body as a whole, for the accident in question subsists in every atom of the atoms of which that body is composed. So you have a thing which is made up of all kinds of atoms, and each and every atom within that group of things has to have the same quality, and the quality has to exist within the atom. For instance, if you look at a piece of snow, right, the Rambam uses as an example, the whiteness doesn't subsist only in the entire whole. It's not like you look at a bunch of snow and there's whiteness, but every single bit of the atom has to have whiteness. And it is because of this that whiteness subsists in their aggregate. That's why when you look at it, it looks white. Similarly, life subsists. So if you look at a person who's alive, right, that person, every single atom within that body has to have life within it, right? If a person has a sensation, every single atom has to have that sensation in it. These kinds of thoughts, even though they're extremely different from the way we perceive of modern science, you do get the sense for the seeds which were planted in the scientific world, which allowed scientists later on to come up with all sorts of ideas, such as in this case, the idea that every single cell has within it, DNA that codes for everything, right? Now, obviously, I'm not saying that they're extremely different, but having these ideas floating in your mind, like every single atom has all of the qualities of a person, you can certainly imagine how that could plant the notions and ideas, which allows a scientist 1,000 years later to come up, to even imagine something like DNA. But I understand, of course, that these are extremely different ideas. I'm just trying to show how the development of science and human thought goes, works. So for life, the senses, intellect, and knowledge are, according to them, accidents. So everything that we have, whether they're our senses, our intellect, our knowledge, these are all qualities that each and every are just like color, and each and every atom contains that particular thing. As regards to the soul, they disagree. Most of them think that each atom has a soul, and therefore the whole, when you put a band together, each atom has just like each atom has life or any other quality. Some of them affirm that a soul is a body composed of subtle atoms, right? That it's made up of a bunch of atoms. So this is an argument that they had. I mean, we can sit and debate that, but it's kind of a moot point. But it's something to, after a few drinks of tequila, you can debate that at the table. But as for the intellect, and I just turned to page 200, I consider that they are unanimous in thinking it is an accident subsisting in an atom belonging to an intellectually cognizing whole. As regards knowledge, there's perplexity among them over whether it is subsisting in every atom or subsisting in only one atom. But so, and again, they're debating these things. These are things that you can't really scientifically prove, but you can debate them. So then he brings some questions that you can ask on this idea, but let's just leave this idea out there. So the fifth premise being that remember that each atom has a quality that make the same quality that's contained in the entire whole of that particular body, which is made up of those atoms. So then we have the sixth premise. So the sixth premise is that, and this is interesting. I'm going to summarize it. You can read it, and your mind can really get twisted around. But the bottom line of what they say here is that because the world exists, units of time are separate, right? And the atoms, each atom is a separate thing. So each one is constantly being created, right? It can only exist for a certain amount of time, right? So each atom exists for, remember, Aristotle said that time, motion and distance were related. And each one of these atoms exists with those measurements. It exists in time, it exists in movement, right? And it's a certain size, a certain measurement. That distance is a certain distance, and each one has to be broken down to its smallest part. So because of that, each atom only really lasts for that tiny drop of time, whatever that smallest unit of time is. So what's happens is that God is constantly recreating all of the atoms. So God creates 18 gajillion, I don't know what number it is, atoms that make up the table that's in front of me, and every less than a split second, whatever that smallest unit of time is, he's recreating it and recreating it and recreating it. So what this did is it led to a philosophical conundrum, because if that's the case, then how does it work that the decisions that I make, right? How could I be responsible for the decisions that I make if literally I'm a different person every second, right? Or less than a second. I'm constantly being remade into something new. And it's just, and Rambam kind of brings that up as a big problem. If you look on page 202, I'm skipping through, reading through it all, because to sum up, I'll go through some of that paragraph. To sum up, this is on 202, the second paragraph. It should not be said in any respect that this is the cause of that, right? In other words, you can never say that A caused B. So if I were to pick up this microphone, so I really didn't pick up the microphone, because every single split second, I thought for a second, I'm going to pick up the microphone. But then God recreated me, recreated my hand, and recreated the microphone, right? 17 billion times before. So what made the microphone go up? because God now is creating a microphone that's here. Now he's creating a microphone that's here. Now he's creating a microphone that's here. Now he's creating a microphone that's here. So on and so forth. So what made the microphone go up? Well, God made the microphone go up because no one else did. It wasn't me, because I'm a different me than I was a few seconds ago. So that's why Rambam ends with the paragraph, with the sentence saying, with regard to beliefs of this kind, it has been said, in my opinion, and in that of everybody endowed with an intellect, whereas one mocketh a man, do ye so mock him. This being in truth the very essence of mockery. Basically, it just doesn't make any sense. But the biggest problem he has with it is that it takes away causation. And once you take away causation, it takes away the foundation of religion in general. But so that's the sixth premise. So the sixth premise being that it's constantly being, each thing, because you have to break everything down to these tiny units, and everything only lasts for those tiny units, everything has to constantly be recreated. The seventh premise, it consists in their belief that privations of habitus are things, right? In other words, things that you don't have, right? Negations, right? Are also things. So they're not the absence of a thing. So darkness isn't the absence of light, but darkness is darkness, right? Stupidity isn't the absence of intelligence, it's stupidity, right? Death isn't the absence of life, it's death. This is at least what their philosophy. And of course, you can go to a freshman philosophy class and put this question out there, and people can all debate it, to whatever, and can have a fun debate, but you'll never really get very far. But this is what they held. This was their opinion. So the explanation is they don't hold that rest is the privation of motion or death is the privation of life, but rather each one is something in it of itself. So for just as heat and cold are accidents existing in the hot and cold, heat is a thing and cold is a thing. So emotion is an accident, is a quality of something, and rest is a quality of something. So this position is analogous like knowledge and ignorance, right? The latter exists. Ignorance is also a thing. So I'm going to leave that at that. So that is the seventh premise. All right. Now I'm just going to go on to the eighth premise. The eighth premise on page 205. So the eighth premise is that I promise you, we are going to get some. Yosef, if you want to say something, go ahead. I just
we talk about philosophy students, but we have the Torah on our side. So if we want to find out what the Torah says about a certain thing, we can. I mean, maybe I am wrong, but it specifically says that God boreh choshech, that there are times that He creates something that is called darkness. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's a new creation. Maybe it was only temporary. Maybe it was whatever. But I'm just saying that, we have the Torah on our side. The Mukatan didn't. So
yeah, well, no, it's. I'm glad you brought it up, because remember, Rambam is giving us these introductions, right? He's going to give us good introductions to the two main scientific disciplines that he was dealing with in his day and his time, which is the Mutakallimun we're reading now, and then the Aristotelians, which we're going to do next when we start Sefer Sheni. But then he's going to say what the Torah says, right? So he's going to modify Aristotle with what the Torah says. So and to a large extent, he's telling us what the world of science says, and then he's going to tell us what at least what the Rambam views the Torah says. So it's good that you brought it up. So right now, this is just a philosophical debate about, but how the Torah guides us and teaches us. We'll get there, but it's going to be a while. but it's an important point that you brought that up. But right now, he's just talking philosophy. He didn't quote the Torah at all yet, right? And there's a reason why, because deliberately he's trying to tell us what the Mutakallimun say. He wants us to know, and he wants us to know that it's important to understand what where they were coming from. So the eighth premise is that's why we have to we're always waiting for the gems, but we need to get the background first to appreciate the gems. But so what's the eighth premise? The eighth one consists in their assertion that there exists nothing except substance and accidents, right? So in other words, like this, everything in the world, right? The bottom line is as follows. Every single thing that we see, everything that we can measure, right, or see or imagine is made up of the same thing. Everything is made up of atoms and the qualities. And I keep using the word qualities because the word accidents just doesn't work in the way we speak modern English. So, and the qualities that each atom contains, and everything, no matter what it is. So in consequence, it's even the body of heaven, the body of the angels, or even the body of God's throne as it is imagined in fantasy. Okay, he's not saying that there is such a thing as God's throne, but anything you can imagine, the way it's built and the way it's made is out of atoms and the qualities that it had. The body of any insect, the body of any plant, etc. It all boils down to atoms, and all the substances of which the universe is composed are the atoms. Okay, that's the 8th premise of the Mutakallimun. The 9th premise, it consists in their assertion that accidents do not serve as a substratum for one another. So what does that mean, right? According to them, it may not be said that one accident has, in other words, every quality that an atom has is directly related to the atom that has that quality. An atom doesn't have a quality because it has another quality. So you can't, it never doesn't pile one on top of the other. So there's an atom, and then you can't say, well, it's blue because it's hot, and hot things are blue. No, it doesn't work that way. It's hot and it's blue. All right, that's what the 9th premise is. So this is what, again, still the 9th premise of the Mutakallimun. So now, this next one gets a little more interesting. The 10th one, the Rambam spends a long time on it. We'll have some interesting thoughts about it. What's the 10th premise of the Mutakallimun? It's the affirmation of admissibility. Admissibility here means things that could be, okay? Admissibility means something that you and I can talk about. It's okay to talk about it because it's within the realm of the possible, or at least within the realm of the discussable. So what does that mean? And this is the main proposition of the science of Kalam. The science of Kalam meaning the philosophy of the Mutakallimun. And I don't know how Kalam is used by modern day Muslims. I unfortunately haven't had a deep conversation with a real Muslim scholar. Maybe one day I will, and I could get their take on this, but I did not have that privilege. But that's what it refers to. So listen to its meaning. They are of the opinion that everything that may be imagined is an admissible notion for the intellect. So if you can imagine something, right, then it's in the realm of the possible. For instance, it is admissible from the point of view of intellect, right, that it should come about that the sphere of the earth should turn in. So because you can remember how Rambam explained how the Aristotelian view, and which was the accepted view of the universe, there was the earth was surrounded by these spheres that were rotating around it. As we get higher and higher, the final sphere is the sphere of heaven, right? So he's saying, if you can imagine the outermost sphere of heaven turning into earth and the earth becoming the outermost sphere, because you can imagine it, even though it's scientifically impossible, then it's admissible. You can imagine such a thing, right? It's something that's intellectually possible, right? So what he's really getting at, and you'll see this as we go through this a little more, is if you imagine the following debate we could have with a physicist. I don't know which side is right or wrong, and if we have a physicist among us, please tell me. But the question being as follows, right? There are certain laws of science with which the world works, the universe works, whatever those laws are, the laws of gravity, the thermodynamics, whatever the laws are, laws of motion, whatever the laws of physics are. Is it possible that a universe exists which runs by a different set of laws, right? Where instead of things going down gravitationally, they go up. Or instead of motion creating heat or releasing heat, it makes it cold. Right? Like, imagine a universe that runs by a completely different set. Or are the laws so basic that it has to be this way, right? So according to the Mutakallimun, if you can intellectually imagine something, right, then it's possible, right? Even if it's not something that we see, it's just as possible as the things that we do see. And this is the way they thought of it. So if you imagine an elephant the size of a flea the size of an elephant, they're all admissible from the point of view of an intellect. The whole world is involved in this method of so whatever thing, if it is admissible that it should be so, and it is possible that it should be otherwise, and it is not more appropriate, it's not better to say things are the way they are versus the way they could be if you can imagine them that way. And so on. I'm kind of running through this again. So this is the idea that if you can imagine something, it's possible. So their answer to that philosophical question of whether it's possible to have a universe which runs by a completely different set of scientific laws, their answer is, if you can imagine it, it's possible. Now, and then he has this little debate between the Mutakallimun and a philosopher that I'm going to skip through, 207 and 208. You're welcome to read it. And I'm going to go to 209, where he says a call upon the reader's attention. Okay, so remember what I just told you about what's admissible according to the Mutakallimun. Now, he said, and Rambam here says something, and this is something that is relevant even to us in 2023. I mean, it's something that we could learn from. So the Mutakallimun were stating that you can imagine something, and if you can imagine it, then that makes it possible, right? So, and Rambam says that you have to differentiate between imagination and intellect, right? In other words, imagination and the rules of science. So you can imagine things, right? But they don't, so the way he's going to say is as follows: "Know, thou who studies this truth." So message to you guys, to us, we're studying this book. If you are of those who know the soul and its powers and have acquired true knowledge of everything as it really is, so you already know that imagination exists in most living beings, right? Every animal has the capability of imagining things. Every animal has images in his or her brain of things that are going on. Every animal sees things, knows things, understands, at least on an imaginary level. They see images. But what makes something have an intellect, right? As for the perfect animal, which in Rambam is referring to a perfect human being, not just every human being, because some human beings aren't very good at this, but the one endowed with a heart. Now remember, in Rambam's view and Aristotle's view, the thought is happening in the heart. The idea, we have it so ingrained in us that it's in the brain because we're modern. But in those days, they thought it was going on in the heart. Okay, so the person endowed with a heart, the existence of imagination in it is clear, that the heart can imagine these views of things. Accordingly, man is not distinguished by having the fact that we could imagine things, right? That we can feel, the beauty of something, the desire for something, you see something great and big and large, or see something small. We could smell something that's terrible or smell something that's wonderful. We can hear something. All that happens to every living being, every creature on earth. That doesn't make human different, right? But it's the intellect that divides the composite things and differentiates their parts. That says, okay, I see an animal, right? I see a deer in front of me, right? But now I'm going to divide that deer into parts, meaning I'm going to say, what makes up that deer? Well, the deer has organs, it has legs, it has skin, it has a heart, it has this, it has that. To break it up, that's intellectual. That's not, that makes a person different, right? So, and then you can make abstractions of them. You can imagine, okay, what makes up a leg? Why does the leg move? And then you can try to represent to them to itself in their true reality and with their causes, what makes it move, and what's the source of energy, and what's this, how does it eat, how, and starts to break it down. That's where the intellect comes in, that the perfect animal, or the human being in this case, so can do that an animal cannot do. So now that we say this, or an animal does not do, so and apprehends from one thing many different notions, then you could learn from, when you see something, then you can say, oh, so that's how it explains this too. Oh, and that explains this too, and so on and so forth, right? So just as two human individuals differ in regard to their existence for the imagination, right? So it is by means of the intellect that the universal is differentiated from the individual. So by using the intellect, you can say, I see a deer in front of me, but from what I'm seeing, I can learn principles that are universal principles, right? I could learn, by watching it, I could say, the deer hasn't eaten in a while, so he's hungry, so he's running to a pile of grass to eat, right? And then I can learn a universal principle from that living beings, when they're hungry, run to food, right? I could extrapolate and come up with universal ideas, and then from that I could make rules of science. I could make, right? it is also through the intellect that essential predicates are discerned from accidental ones, right? I can say certain things have to be a certain way, and certain things just are a certain way. None of these acts belong to the imagination. That's not something that happens from the imagination. The imagination might see something, but the intellect is what's able to divide it up and break it down and then come up with principles from it. And this is certainly true. You know, this is just as much a modern idea as it is a medieval idea, right? You know, that trying to understand something, and it gets much deeper than this. So thus, someone using his imagination imagines a human. You can have an imagination and imagine a human with a horse's head and wings and so on, right? This is called something that's invented, right? Because nothing exists corresponds to it, right? In its apprehension, imagination is not able to hold itself aloof from matter, even if it turns a form into an extreme abstraction. This reason there can no be, so you can't tell the imagination that's possible or that's impossible, you know, because you can't, because the imagination isn't capable of declaring things possible, isn't capable of making extrapolations and rules. So now that we say this, he says here what so this is interesting. On page 210, the long paragraph, it starts with, "Hear what the mathematical sciences have taught us, and how capital are the premises which we have obtained from them." So no, there are things that if you consider them with your imagination, you can't consider them at all, right? You're unable to represent themselves to yourself, right? You find it's impossible to imagine them in such a way that it's impossible to have two contrary things agree. However, despite the fact that you think it's impossible, it's actually true. Now, this is really the bedrock of understanding modern science, right? And that because thus, and his example is, and you can read through it, but basically his example is the Earth is a sphere, right? And we know that things fall downward, right? Now, how could it be that one person standing on this side of the Earth, the Rambam says, and another person standing on this side of the Earth, because the Rambam says we know that the inhabited Earth goes at least as far enough that there could be someone at this end and someone at that end, right? This is what he says. You can read through it if you like in his words. So how is it possible that this guy's feet are falling that way and this guy's feet are falling that way, right? So in your imagination, it seems impossible, right? But we know that it's true. So what's fascinating here is the Rambam doesn't go on to give you an answer to that conundrum, right? But he knew that there would someday, but the intellect is what's necessary to figure out the answer to that conundrum. So the Rambam is saying, this is something that I can't figure out, right? But I know it's true. So he's saying that's how I know that the intellect is different from the imagination, right? Because the imagination can't imagine such a thing. We think about it and we get all confused, right? Now, maybe you and I don't, because we went to school and we learned about gravity being pulled towards the center, right, of mass, of a large mass at the center of the Earth. But in the Rambam's time, when they're thinking of things are always going down, right, it didn't make sense, right? So how do you explain it, right? So it is thus impossible. So this cannot even be represented to oneself. He says, I'm kind of going, for one of them is not placed above and the other below. Each of them is both above and below, right? And then he goes through another thing about two lines that go on and on and on forever and get closer, but never quite reach each other. And again, he says, so that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin, accordingly, and this is the bottom paragraph that starts accordingly, it has been demonstrated that something that the imagination cannot imagine or apprehend, and that is impossible from its point of view, can exist. Just like, so we just said that it has similarly been demonstrated, I'm on the top of 211, that something the imagination considers as necessary, that we can imagine, we do imagine something, and we think it absolutely has to be true, but it's impossible, right? It's impossible scientifically to happen. And to let these words flow into your heart for a second. Namely, what is that? God, may he be exalted, right? Our imagination, right? In our minds, in our hearts, we know he's there, but we can't explain it scientifically. I want you to just sit with that thought for a moment, right? Because you know, it's such a powerful idea that according to the imagination, I can't imagine something that doesn't have, I need to describe it somehow. I have to be able to say it has a head, it has a heart, it has arms, or it looks like a stone, it looks like a rock, it looks like a waterfall, it looks like a flower. I have to have something. But so I can't imagine God. I just can't, right? We want to, but we can't, because our brains are completely incapable of doing that. But on the other hand, we still know that he exists. So the Rambam just demonstrated two things. Now, so to disprove the Mutakallimun, right? Number one, there are many things that we can't imagine, but we know they exist, right? And we have to use our intellect to figure out how. And there are many things that we know exist, right? But we can't imagine. So, so therefore, accordingly, it is clear that there is something else by means. So how do you figure out what really is true? How do you figure out these rules, right? How, so this is the big question, right? We have to think about this, right? Accordingly, it is clear. I'm reading from the paragraph, this first paragraph on 211, that there is something else by means of which is necessary, that which is admissible, and that something is not the imagination, right? So there is a speculation, there is a way of figuring this out, but it's not what you can imagine. So the fact that you can imagine something cannot possibly be what makes it real. On the contrary, and so on. And then he says that even the Mutakallimun recognize this a little bit. I'm skipping down. And now the next paragraph on 211, consider thou who art engaged in speculation and perceive that a method of profound speculation has arisen. For with regard to particular mental representations, one person thinks that they are intellectual and another person thinks they're just imaginary. So we wish consequently to find something that would enable us to distinguish things cognized intellectually from those that are imagined. We need to figure it out. We need to figure out how to make the difference between these two. So this is something it's really cool to think about, is what the Rambam's saying, right? This is a method of profound speculation, something really interesting to think about. So here he says, and listen to this carefully. For if the philosopher says as he does, that which exists is my witness, and by means of it we discern the necessary, the possible, and the impossible. In other words, a philosopher will say, I look at the world that's around me, and by looking at what's here, and looking what I can see, and looking what I can measure, that's how I tell you what's real and what's not real. We disagree. And here you'll say, Rambam does bring God and the Torah in for a minute. The adherent of the Torah, it says the law here, but the other translation here would be the Torah. A religious person, actually in the Hebrew translation, it's dat, which is, it means the word, the adherent of religion would say, is with dispute with us, is regard with this point. So remember that remember we talked about the debate between physics. Does the world have to be the way it is, right? So the physicist would say, these are the rules of science. This is the only way it could be, right? The Mutakallimun would say, right, that no, it could be in a million different ways, right? And a religious person or the adherent of the Torah would say, no, it could be in a million different ways. But the reason why we see what we see is because God wanted it that way. For we claim that which exists was made in virtue of will and was not a necessary con. It doesn't have to be this way. It could have been in any number of a million ways, but it is this way because God made it that way, right? Now, if it was made in this fashion, right, then it is admissible that it should be made in a different way, unless intellectual representation decides, as we think it decides, that something different from what exists at present is not admissible. So, and I know it's getting a little confusing, but hold on a second. And that I have something to say, which you will learn in various passages in this treatise. So I just fed you a little bit of a religious perspective. It's like the Rambam saying, whoa, I just got ahead of myself. But let's go back to the Mutakallimun. I'll get back to my ideas later. But it's not something one hastens to reject an entire with nonchalance. All right, so we'll get there. All right. But so the bottom line is that he touched on three. He intended to tell us about two ways of looking at things, and then he threw in at the end, he couldn't hold himself back from throwing in a third way of looking at things, which is that, yes, it could be a million different ways. You know, the whole idea that there might be 1,000 different universes, and every time you make a decision, it makes another universe. The string theory would add something that just confuses me. But But yeah, it could be 1,000,000, but it's not. And why isn't it? Because this is what God decided how it should be. Okay, so now we're running out of time. So I got to do the 11th and the 12th premises. So let's do them quickly. So the 11th one is that there's no, it's impossible that there's anything such thing as infinity, right? Remember, because everything is made out of little particles, I'll just to just really quickly say this outside. It's impossible that it should end, right? Everything has a finite number. The number might be 18 bazillion, whatever the number is, but it's made out of a certain amount of particles, and time itself is made out of a certain amount of time particles, right? And distance is made out of a certain amount of distance particles, and so on and so forth. So it's impossible that the world is around forever and will just keep on going forever. And so that was the 11th premise. And then the 12th premise, right, is that these senses do not always procure certain knowledge. In other words, we can only sense certain things, right? But we don't sense everything, right? So you can't necessarily trust what you see. You can't necessarily trust what you can measure. You can't trust what you can feel. So these things are the 12 premises of the Mutakallimun, which gives us an understanding. In the next chapter, I'm going to try, B'li without making a promise, I'm going to try in the next lecture to do 74 and 75, in which he says how the Mutakallimun use these 12 premises. Remember, we're talking about religious philosophers. They're Islamic philosophers, and they want to conclude the same 4 things that we as Jews believe, which is the Metziut, the existence of God, the oneness of God, that God doesn't have a body, and that the world was created. So he's going to say how they use these 12 premises to prove those, and then he's going to have some difficulties with it, and then he's going to end this book, so the book 1, so we can go on to book 2, when he's going to start with Aristotle's ideas. So we only have a few minutes for questions. I didn't realize how long this was going to take. I'm sorry, but I tried to explain extremely difficult concepts in a reasonably understandable way. So I hope I achieved it a little bit, but fire away with quick questions if you have any. If there are none, I understand. This was a difficult subject.
Thank you for answering mine. That was great.
Oh, no problem. But yeah, we have to. This is going to be fun, and but we have to be patient. Rambam is building up, but every time he's going to drop these bombs, so we'll get there. But I appreciate everyone joining me tonight, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. And Mir Hashem, God willing, we'll see you next week. All right.
Thank you.
All
right. Bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.